Oh, dear colleagues, one minute. Okay, hello, dear colleagues. Thank you for joining us in such a not easy time. Uh, we understand that there are a lot of problems with electricity and with internet connections in Ukraine. So we'll have that meeting recorded, and also we are having stream right now, so you can join a recording of stream also later. Uh, yeah, before I will introduce our today's speakers, some technical questions. So please mute your microphones if you don't want to speak. If you want to speak, please raise your hand, and then you will have an opportunity to turn on your microphone. If you have any questions, you can write them in Q&A section. Yeah, and I don't want to actually steal time from our today's speakers, and I want to introduce Nathan Sanders. Hello, Nathan. And I hope that Bruce Schneider will join us a bit later. So, Nathan, the floor is yours. Looking forward to hear.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be able to be in dialogue with you all. Thank you so much for joining this. I know as we just discussed how difficult conditions are in Ukraine right now, both to join this conversation and for your work. And so I'm just really grateful that you're sharing your time with me, and I look forward to having a great discussion. So I'll speak a little bit about some of the ideas that we share in my co-author Bruce Schneier in my new book, which is called Rewiring Democracy. And I'll try and particularly focus on what I think the role of this community of scholars and scientists and engineers is in shaping the future of our democracy in Ukraine, in the US, and around the world as we go through this technological transformation. So I will share my screen. I want to introduce myself a little bit to say that I'm a researcher at Harvard University, affiliated with the Berkman-Klein Center. My background is in the physical sciences. My PhD is in astrophysics. I really value and engage with scientific societies and communities, particularly here in the U.S. I served on the board of the American Institute of Physics for several years, and have supported the community of physical sciences professional societies through other forms of service, and just really value the work that organizations like yours provides to our broader scientific enterprise. And so that's why I'm excited to be able to focus on our role as scholars in this important transformation. So here's our book, Rewiring Democracy. I would love if you pick it up, if you read it, your feedback, please feel free to reach out to me after this conversation, as well as the conversation that we'll have here today. So the key questions that we're trying to pose for this discussion is first to recognize that AI is transforming democratic processes around the world. To be honest with you, when we used to give this a version of this talk, we would focus on trying to convince people that AI really was impacting democratic processes. I don't think we have to do that anymore necessarily. You know, I know there are great examples in Ukraine, some of which have reached our awareness here in the US, including the really powerful use of AI as a communication tool in a multilingual and international way that the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine has leveraged the technology for. And that's one of just hundreds of examples that we chronicle in our book that I think has made it very clear to everybody now just how much AI is affecting our democratic processes. But I think the bigger questions that are very much unanswered are, with that transformation, who writes the rules? Who is in charge of deciding what the future of a democracy transformed by this technology looks like? And who benefits from it and who loses out through that transformation? And in particular, how do we ensure that the public benefits and that the public has a voice and helps shape that process? And that's not just left to the corporations and the autocrats, which, to be frank, from my perspective here in the US, seems to be where so much of the concentration of power happening around AI today lives. How do we change that? So I'm going to try and share up front some of the takeaways that I hope you'll have after our conversation today. This is the way I feel. First of all, we do have agency in this transformation. The trends that we can see around us today in terms of environmental impacts, concentration of wealth, corporate control that surround AI do not have to be our future. We can act, change that. We can steer AI towards the public good and to benefit our democracies and our democratic systems. And I believe scientists and engineers have a really special role and a special capacity to shape that future. So I'm going to try and focus our discussion on some examples that we've seen around the world of where scientists and engineers and their communities are coming together to have those types of impacts. And what can we learn from that? We'll divide the talk up into two sections, point solutions, sort of individual, maybe more incremental examples of scientists and engineers using AI in ways that benefit democracy. And then we'll look at some more systemic solutions that are maybe aiming at a larger transformation that hasn't fully happened yet, but we can maybe learn from examples of democracies that are trying to go down that route. And then I'll leave you with the plan of action that we lay out in our book, which is in terms of four primary methods of steering that future of AI and democracy in terms of responsibly using the technology, resisting inappropriate uses, reforming the AI ecosystem, and renovating our democracy. So at this point, let me just mention, I hope my co-author Bruce Schneier will be able to join us in this conversation. I know he's in transit. He let me know he may not be able to join, but I'll guide us through this discussion. And if Bruce joins, I'll swap over and we'll both be in dialogue here. Okay, so I'll start with some of the point solutions that we're learning from around the world in terms of how scientists and engineers are applying AI in pro-democratic ways. I want to start with an example from Brazil that you may be familiar with, because this is a project that's been around for about a decade now. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the Portuguese, but the English name for this project is Operation Love Serenade. It's funny, it's actually named after a Brazilian chocolate brand. And the reason is that there was a story that came to light of a public official in Brazil spending large amounts of public funding in inappropriate ways. And one of the examples was them spending it on these fancy chocolates, the Love Serenade chocolates. And so a community of data scientists and software engineers in Brazil a decade ago responded to that example by trying to root out those instances of public corruption, by trying to analyze public expense reports that were transparently disclosed. They had access to that data, but to try and leverage technology, to try and leverage machine learning to automatically identify incongruous instances of public expense reports, to try and bring to light examples of inappropriate spending so that action could be taken, so that they could make a public report transparently to the public that should lead to an investigation. And so they built first of all, a machine learning process to automatically take those expense reports as they continuously are made, analyze them, and identify instances of possible corruption. And then also a bot that posted on Twitter called Rosie that would publicly share those examples and hopefully lead to investigations. And so we have some more statistics in our book about what the impact of this has been, but it's been fairly significant. They have attributed to this project uncovering more than 8 million reals, or about $1.5 million US dollars of irregular expenditures that has led to hundreds of investigations around public corruption for a large number of officials. And of course, there are real concerns about how to do this responsibly. There are concerns about false positives. There are concerns about bringing to light an expense that may look irregular, but is not actually fraudulent or illegal in any way. And there's a very important need for human review here, not just to take the output of a machine learning tool and assign consequences to a public official, but rather to go through an appropriate channel for human review, like the investigatory processes that exist. So there are real risks to be managed in this process. But ultimately, I see this as an example of leveraging this technology of AI responsibly in a way to enhance the power of citizens and communities over their government, to provide a watchdogging role or a public oversight role that's very important in every democracy, but is generally very hard for people to do. It's hard for organizations, even civil society organizations that are focused on that watchdogging function, to have the staff capacity, to have the people, to have the attention to be able to review thousands or millions of expense reports. And so this is, I think, a really great example of engineers leveraging this technology to augment the capabilities and the capacity of those civil society organizations and to help them do this work at larger scale. I also want to call out the organization that led this project, Operation Love Serenade, has gone on to do many more things over time. They have sort of a whole stack of civic technology, government oversight, public transparency projects that have grown up in the years since Operation Love Serenade was established. And so I think it's also an example of showing how to build a sustainable ecosystem around these tools, not just to write a piece of software, put it out in the world and walk away, but to build an institution and the civic capacity around this kind of a function. So this is the story of Operation Lost Serenade. I want to switch gears. I want to share one example of some of the work that I'm directly involved in. It's the only time it's the only example I'll share that's my own today. But some colleagues and I here in Massachusetts have built what we call MAPLE, the Massachusetts Platform for Legislative Engagement. We have a volunteer community of software developers and UX designers and lawyers and other experts from our academic community here in Massachusetts, from institutions like Northeastern University, Harvard University, where I'm based, Boston College, Boston University, who have come together to build a platform, an online tool that we believe really solves a challenge in helping constituents in our state have their voice heard in policymaking processes. Our legislature here in Massachusetts has been continuously operating for about 400 years. It's actually older than the US, than the federal government itself. We have a long tradition of the legislature hearing from constituents. That's not new. However, as our democracy has evolved, I would say that that capacity for legislative engagement has frayed in some really meaningful ways as the population of our state has grown from, a really small community in the 16th century into a community of many millions of people. The capacity of our legislature, which is actually roughly the same size that it was many, many generations ago, to represent and to hear from and to synthesize the perspective of constituents has degraded. And so we're trying to solve that problem. We're trying to make it easier for people with, our busy modern lives to be able to articulate and share their perspective on issues of public policy with the legislature. We're trying to make it easier for people to learn about what policies are under consideration and to understand the policies that are proposed, to be able to understand the legal language that bills are written in and what that means and what the context is around the legislative process, and ultimately to have their voice heard, to transmit their perspective to the legislature. So Maple is a civil technology project online at mapletestimony.org. It's totally open source. We hope that other constituencies will copy what we've done and find it useful and maybe deploy it in their own jurisdiction as well. We have found AI is a very useful tool in building this platform. Part of our goal is to help people understand pending legislation. And so we use AI to summarize bills into concise, plain language versions. We've done that to summarize more than 25,000 bills that have been introduced in the Massachusetts legislature. And we know that advocacy communities find this really useful because there are so many bills in our legislature session. We have about 8,000 bills under consideration every session. It can be very difficult to even navigate and know how to organize a community around policy change. It's hard to identify what a constituency cares about, how that translates to an item that is proceeding through the legislature, a bill that has an opportunity to move. We've tried to make that much easier by translating the legal language of that bill into something that's easy to understand, and also by assigning those bills to a taxonomy that makes those 8,000 pieces of legislation much more navigable. We've just rolled out a new feature that also makes the public debate that happens in the legislature, physically in the building itself, more accessible. Our legislature, ever since 2020, since COVID, has been publishing video recordings of hearings, and we've made those searchable and accessible by automatically transcribing them using AI. So now we have thousands of hours of public hearings that represent, the body of deliberation that happens in our legislature, but is not very accessible if you have to watch thousands of hours of video to see it. We've transcribed that video to make it searchable so that people can easily find discussion about the issues and bills that they care about. And we also now have been operating Maple for 2 sessions, and we've reached a milestone of having thousands of comments on bills, testimony submitted to the legislature through our platform. And so now we're also starting to leverage AI to make sense of what people are saying about bills, to identify opportunities to bridge real differences of perspective that people share on bills, also to identify points of consensus when people who may not know that they ultimately feel the same way about a policy really do agree on some fundamental tenet, and ultimately to make recommendations for consumption by human legislators about what the path forward is for legislation. So we view Maple as an example of renovation of democracy. We know that in Massachusetts, like many other jurisdictions, we've had a degradation of some of the core functions of our representative democracy. We're trying to renovate those functions and strengthen them. And we think Maple is a useful tool in doing that, and Maple uses AI as a useful part of what we do. Okay, at this point, I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about solutions that are a little bit more systemic than the ones I just shared. These are examples of scientists and engineers who are supporting building a foundation for larger scale transformation. So the first example I want to talk about addresses one of those big questions that I called out earlier. Who benefits from AI? Who captures the value and steers the direction of this technology, which has been so influential and seems to be accelerating in its influence over our society and government? And so I said earlier, and I believe this very strongly, that one of the greatest risks that we see in American democracy today, certainly, if not for the globe, is the concentration of wealth that is happening around AI development today. The fact that the largest companies, arguably in the history of the world, in terms of market capitalization, are the companies profiting from AI today. The multi-trillion-dollar market capitalizations that we have around big tech companies that are primarily, US-based, San Francisco-based companies, I think is really alarming. I think it represents the growth of an oligarchy, and especially to the extent to which those companies have influence with our federal government in the US, a potentially fascist system that we need to resist. We need to find an alternative way to develop this technology. And from my point of view, there is nothing inherent about the technology, about AI, that requires it to be developed this way. I think this is a manifestation of a capitalist system that has provided a set of incentives that has led AI to be developed in this corporate model, but there are alternatives. So the alternative that we advocate for in our book, Rewiring Democracy, is public AI, technology that's developed under public control and by public agencies as a counterbalance to corporate AI, and to give public institutions the opportunity to steer the development of, and also to capture as a public good and as a public benefit some of the value that's being created by AI. So we're advocating for this as a strategy to take AI out of the exclusive hands of corporations. We think that in the future, it may serve an increasingly important role in giving people universal access to this technology, which seems to be part of the core infrastructure that we'll all live with in the 21st century. And we don't want to be behind corporate paywalls and extracted for private profit. I think there's a trend that's been very visible over the past year or so, where AI companies that have leveraged so much venture funding and investment to develop and to offer their capabilities, in many cases for free, are now thinking much more immediately about monetizing that technology, extracting profit from it, charging people hundreds of dollars a month for some of the premier offerings that big tech companies have around AI. And I think it's going to be an increasing trend. And it leads to potentially a two-tiered system where the wealthy have access to transformational capabilities and core infrastructure, and people with less money don't. And I think we need to have a plan for more universal access for this infrastructure. I think public control of this technology is also very important for transparency, so that we can understand and have insight into how models are developed, what values are intentionally embedded into them, what processes they take for development, what ethical principles they do or do not follow during development, such as the use of appropriately licensed or not appropriately licensed content and training. I think we really need an alternative with public control to be sure that the development process and ethical considerations in AI development are aligned to our democratic principles. And I think we need measures of accountability and oversight. Ultimately, corporate AI systems are accountable to shareholders, and they're not accountable to the public. Public AI provides a fundamentally different basis for trust and a different basis for accountability than a corporate AI system does. I think a public AI system can also be much more responsive to public demand. It can be developed with public control. We can leverage our democratic systems, our electoral systems, our systems of appointments and checks and balances between branches of government, in the same way that we do for other public functions and public agencies, and apply that to the development of AI. And that gives us a fundamentally different way to administer and make sure that the technology is developed in a way that's useful to our society than a corporate model. And then lastly, this point about capturing value, the idea that we can have a shared and public investment in a technology that the markets, the world seems to think we'll have a transformative economic impact. I think we should realize and capture as much of that value as we can for the public and also locally around the world, not only having all that value accrue to a small number of companies in California, but to have that value capture be shared by communities around the world. So we proposed an AI public option as an alternative to corporate AI and critical infrastructure for the 21st century. And Bruce and I and our colleague Henry Farrell have been writing about this and proposing this kind of an outcome for years, going back to early 2023. And for years, we wrote about this as aspirational. Maybe a lot of people saw it as a pipe dream, but it's been really exciting for us to see examples of public AI development become fully realized around the world. The example that I want to share with you is from Europe, from Switzerland, where Swiss researchers, scientists and engineers at Swiss institutions, at EPFL, at ETH Zurich, have developed what I think is the world's most fully realized vision of that public AI model I described, which is called Apertus. This is a model that was released in late 2025, just a few months ago. It's entirely open and transparent in a way that commercial so-called open source or open weight models generally are not. Unlike, for example, Meta's so-called open source Llama model, not only is the code of the model open, not only are the weights of the model open, but the development process, the decisions and recipes used for training the model are transparent. And this is most differentiating, the data used for training the model is open as well. And it's data that was not stolen, that is following the rules and licensing restrictions around the content that they're training on. They've trained this model at a large scale, 15 trillion tokens. You'll note this is not nearly the scale that the largest private models are. Companies like OpenAI are not as transparent as they used to be about exactly how their models are configured and the scale that they're on. But this is probably at least one, maybe two orders of magnitude smaller than the largest foundation or so-called frontier models from corporate AI development. And I think that's actually valuable. I think part of providing this alternative to corporate AI is showing a more sustainable version of AI development that is not focused on a goal of so-called super intelligence or artificial general intelligence, where companies are competing to train the largest possible version of an AI model month after month and trying to leapfrog each other maybe 0.5% at a time and the performance of those models, but rather instead trying to build something that is useful and trying to do just enough, use just enough resources to build something that is useful for public administration, for people's private use as well. One of the ways that Apertus has tried to differentiate itself from those commercial models and being useful is by focusing on serving the multilingual society in Switzerland and in Europe, by focusing on training with a representative data set across 1,000 languages instead of focusing primarily on English or just not being thoughtful and concerned about the language representation of the community that they're serving. Part of the reason why having transparency and accountability to the public about the ethical considerations of model development is so important is because I think it has really meaningful impacts on labor and the future of labor. We know that there have been really alarming instances of some of the commercial AI developers exploiting labor, particularly labor from the global south, in model training, particularly for data labeling, for human feedback, for reinforcement learning. And we can see the development process that was taken for the Swiss model, and we can validate that that was not done, that they are following appropriate European principles and values in the development of the model. And then finally, this is a model that is offered as a public good. It is free for all to use and build on top of. If we want to see public AI as an alternative to corporate AI as foundational universal infrastructure, this is showing what that can look like. Okay, so that's the vision of public AI. I want to show you one more vision for transformational change that comes from Asia, from Japan. This is the story of a candidate who has started a movement in Japan. The candidate's name is Takahiro Ano, and he ran for office for the first time about a year and a half, 2 years ago in 2024. He was running for governor of Tokyo, and he was unknown as a political candidate. He had never run for office before. He was not affiliated with a party. He had no establishment or apparatus behind him, and yet he had some success. He did not win that race, but out of a very crowded field of 56 candidates, he came in fifth and won, I think, 150,000 votes in Tokyo, which was an unexpected finish. And the way that he did that was by trying to innovate in how he engaged with the electorate. He leveraged technology and AI, his skill set as a software engineer, to do this. He developed applications that allowed him to engage with voters at scale. One of the things that he did in his gubernatorial campaign is to have an avatar of himself, not a hyper-realistic deep fake, but really just kind of a simplistic, cartoonish representation of himself, engage in dialogue with voters. He put that avatar on YouTube and had it continuously live stream for 17 days and just continuously took questions from Japanese voters and ultimately responded to more than 8,000 questions about his political platform as a method of engagement and informing the electorate about what he stood for. So when we wrote our book, Rewiring Democracy, this had all just happened, and he had come in fifth but lost that Tokugawa gubernatorial race. What's happened since we wrote the book is that he has now been elected to the national legislature in Japan, to the Diet, in their upper chamber. So he is now an elected official and the leader of a new political party in Japan called Team Mirai. Bruce and I have just published a piece about what Team Mirai is doing today in 2026 in Japan, and I think it's totally fascinating. Their party leader, Takahiro Ono, describes this new party as a utility party. They're not trying to align themselves very heavily in an ideological way, for better or worse. Instead, they're trying to chart a middle ground on social and ideological issues, but trying to be, to use their words, trying to be extreme to the extent to which they engage with the public and they leverage technology to do it. They have a vision of digital democracy, which is a sort of a more transformational form of that democracy renovation that I talked about that a project like Maple is doing. And the way that they're trying to get there to try and change how Japanese democracy operates, to be more scalable, to engage more people, to listen more broadly to the public by leveraging technology, they're getting there by being a utility, by leveraging public funding that is distributed to Japanese political parties to hire software engineers to build open source tools that everybody in Japan can use, that are available to all political parties in Japan, that operate on behalf of the legislature and that everyone can use. I've got screenshots of a couple of examples here that I think are interesting. The screenshot on the left is for a platform called Jikai, which translates roughly to assembly. This is the assembly app. And this provides information and context about the major issues and bills that are being considered in the Diet. So the way it works is that it anchors to a bill, and then it pulls in lots of context to help people understand why that bill is important and what it would do. It automatically searches the web and finds journalistic reporting and news related to that issue. It allows people to ask questions of this interface about what the bill would do, what its impacts would be, and what the context is, and to give them answers. It's an information sharing tool that is aimed at increasing engagement with the legislature. I think the example on the right is even more interesting. This is called the AI interviewer tool. And this is a part of how Takahiro Ono built his political platform when running for the Diet. The way it works is that an individual constituent has a conversation with a chatbot that is bidirectional. It's aimed at doing two things. One is to inform them about a political issue or a position being taken by the party that's using it. And two is to gather their feedback. So after having a dialogue with a chatbot, there is a very visible outcome, which is a recommended change to the party's policy platform. It's a red line or literally a pull request in GitHub for the party leadership to consider, for the, in this case, the candidate Takahiro Ono to consider, saying, AI interviewers had a conversation with this constituent. Here's what they thought about the issue, and here's how they would recommend you change your platform. It's translating that conversation into a policy proposal. And then the candidate gets to decide, has the agency decide, am I going to accept this or not? Am I going to change my platform to accommodate the perspective of that constituent or not? And then the constituent gets to see that outcome. They get to see in a very one-to-one way, I had a conversation with the tool operated by this party. Did they accept my feedback? Did they apply it or not? It's one of several examples for how this party is trying to use technology, not just to listen to people, but to show them that they are part of the political process. And I think that's really, really interesting. So right now, this is a small movement in Japan. This is a movement with a party leader who's the first elected official of that party. It remains to be seen how influential it will be. It remains to be seen how many other parties will leverage these tools that they're building. It remains to be seen how many other legislators will be elected as part of this party and on this platform. But to me, it's a really interesting example because it represents a fundamentally different vision for how democracies should operate and how we can renovate democracies. And I hope it will be an example that spurs innovation and experimentation in other places around the world. So I'm going to draw to a conclusion here, and then I'm really eager to get into discussion with you all. The conclusion that I hope you feel supported that we've been building to is that as scientists and engineers, we have a special capacity to shape the future of our democracy as it is being infused with AI. There are at least four discrete ways that we can do that. We can work to reform the ecosystem of AI, the way the technology is being developed, to make it fundamentally more ethical, more equitable, and trustworthy. Examples like the AppReduce project in Switzerland and the development of public AI show what that looks like. We can and should, as scientists and engineers, resist harmful uses of AI in governance. I think we have a special technical knowledge to be able to share with the public and with our elected officials a perspective on when it is and is not appropriate to use AI in governance. I haven't highlighted examples of that form of resistance here today, but hopefully that resonates with you and you can think of some and we can discuss them. Third, to responsibly use AI to identify ways to leverage our skills as scientists and engineers and technology as it develops to make our democracy better. And I think the Love Serenade example from Brazil is an interesting example of that. And then lastly, to renovate our democracy, to help fix problems that pre-existed technological change, pre-existed the modern developments of AI, but leverage that technology to make our democracy meaningfully better. And I hope those examples from Maple and Team Mirai in Japan demonstrate that. So I'll land here. I'm so eager to be in discussion with you all. I hope you found this interesting, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks a lot, Nathan, for that exciting talk. I believe it's really relevant for Ukraine. So, dear colleagues, please raise your hand to write your questions in the chat. I want to start with one example which is extremely relevant for Ukraine right now. So I don't know if you're familiar about LLM grooming attacks and what is Russia doing to spread propaganda through the industrial like LLMs. So shortly, the principle is like they published a huge amount of websites, fed them with AI-generated propaganda, and then big LLM chatbots like ChatGPT and Gemini and so on, basically all of them, were trained using the data and basically spread that propaganda in the chatbot itself. So if such actors, not only Russia, deliberately seed propaganda, so the chatbot repeated later. What is the right accountability model? I mean, on model developers, on data pipelines, on platforms, or something else maybe. And what would due diligence mean in that concrete terms?
It's a great question. I think you're absolutely right that the adoption of AI has opened up whole new surfaces of threats in cybersecurity in our information ecosystem. My co-author Bruce, who looks like won't be able to join us, is a cybersecurity specialist, and I know he would have strong thoughts to add here too. But I'll share my perspective. I think that this is a vulnerability both in the training process, corrupting the training data for foundation models, and also at the time of inference. During retrieval augmented generation, RAG processes, as models increasingly retrieve information on our behalf and try and analyze that for us in response to a question. That kind of pollution of the information ecosystem you're describing is a threat for both. For the training process in particular, to me, this just emphasizes how important it is to have transparency around data. I think, many people that I talk with that are very concerned about AI development are often concerned about what training data is being used and the biases in that data and the fact that often it is effectively stolen content. And I think those are very legitimate concerns. And I always do think of how that could be different. Again, I don't think there's anything inherent to the technology that makes it impossible to understand what data is trained on or impossible to measure if it has been corrupted by one or another source. Instead, the reason that's hard today is that we're developing AI in a corporate model where companies do not want to disclose what data they're training on, primarily because they're concerned about legal risk. Because I think they know that in many cases, they're using data in ways that they are not authorized for and are opening themselves up to lawsuits if they disclose what they're training on. that's one of the several reasons why the public AI model that we've talked about I think is really valuable because it provides a model for developing AI in a much more transparent way that makes it much more auditable and gives us clear mechanisms for oversight over public agencies developing the models in terms of what data they use. Gives us the ability to inspect if the data they've been used has been corrupted and an ability to act, a more responsive institution that is accountable to the public that's using the model to make changes if there's a problem.
Great, thank you. So if we are talking about copyright and auditing, like last week, The Atlantic published an article based on their research that actually chatbots can replicate the whole books. That means that they are actually saving the text, not just training on that. What do you think? Is there a possibility that publishers and maybe huge media will sue that companies, and the only way to combat that problem will be just deleting the whole models and build a new one with transparent data and transparent process?
A great question. I'll try and answer just a little bit from the legal perspective, and I'm not a lawyer, and then a little bit more from the technical perspective, and I am a data scientist. From the legal perspective, a lot of you may be aware in the US, we've already had a major lawsuit against one of our major AI developers, Anthropic, that resulted in a settlement with book authors. And so now Anthropic is paying out, I think the number is $3,000 per book to virtually every published author, at least in the US, because they've, even if they've sort of indemnified themselves through the settlement process, they've at least tacitly acknowledged that those books were inappropriately used during the training process. In the US, I don't think that'll be the last such lawsuit. I don't have a legal perspective on what that looks like internationally and around the world. Um, from a technical perspective, to me, the ability that has been demonstrated for large language models, foundation models, to regurgitate, to memorize the contents of books, I see that as a technical failure. That is not the way these systems are supposed to work. That is not the way they're promised to work. So many of the AI labs that are focused on, developing super intelligence, developing reasoning capabilities, are telling the public that their models are doing more than just memorizing what somebody wrote on the internet 20 years ago and spitting it back, but actually creating new knowledge, creating new insight, and legitimately reasoning. And I actually think that there's a lot of compelling evidence of cases where the models are capable of that kind of insight and reasoning. I actually think that is possible for this technology to do. However, this demonstrates that the models are being developed in such a way as to not fully realize that vision. They're really not supposed to be just regurgitating content. And I think there's a specific technical reason for that, which is that many of the current largest foundation models are actually over parameterized. They're actually being trained at too large of a scale. They have too many parameters. That is the technical mechanism by which they are memorizing the content of books. They're storing that information in their parameter networks and able to regurgitate it. And again, that's not the way they're supposed to work. I think it's telling us that that is a flaw in the model design. I mentioned when we talked about the Swiss model Apertus, it's developed at a smaller scale that's more sustainable. And I think that's actually there's some technical innovation that needs to happen to leverage that smaller scale because again, the models aren't supposed to be just memorizing their training data. There's another project from Norway, and forgive me, I don't remember the names of the researchers who are leading it, but they're explicitly focused on developing super intelligent AI. That's their goal, to develop super intelligent AI at a massively smaller scale. They're focused on doing technical innovation to show that they can achieve the same results as the largest models, but by training them on a much smaller scale that is much, much more memory and compute and energy efficient. And I do think that there's the technical possibility for that to work.
Great, thank you. Yes, the reason I'm asking is that I think that it was too technical failure, but how to solve the problem? You cannot undo the training. So maybe the only reason is to completely kill the model and build a new one.
Well,
Uh, yeah.
I think the way that companies are trying to mitigate that today is by putting post-processing filters at inference time that try and check if the model has regurgitated copyrighted content and to prevent it from being shown to the user. And on the one hand, that's probably good. We'd probably prefer that they don't, regurgitate Harry Potter to users. The publisher of Harry Potter would probably prefer that. But on the other hand, it's just demonstrating that it's kind of papering over. It's putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem.
Yeah, so, and this is basically censorship.
So sorry, say it again.
So, and that's basically a censorship when they will control the like output after the model generates it.
Censorship, right. I do think that's it's an example of that. And I think there's a careful balance to be reached there because in general, in order for the models to work in pro-social ways, I think we want what are often called guardrails on them. I think we want to check their outputs and validate that they pass thresholds in terms of not having explicit content that's shared with minors, for example. I think that kind of post-processing is good, but there's as is always the case in information ecosystems, there is a slippery slope and a careful line to be reached between those pro-social uses of those guardrails and censorship. I agree.
Dear colleagues, waiting for your questions, but I still have plenty, plenty of them. The next question is sovereign AI, which is very trendy today. I mean, the AI built by countries, by governments, for different reasons. Let's say it like that. So in Ukraine, we also started to build national large language models, mostly because of the reasons I already mentioned, because of the historical context, because of cultural context and Russian propaganda to make it possible to use AI in educational systems and governmental systems. So, what do you think? What are the like what you can advise on the design step, how to better do it? Actually, I see some people who are from the team of that project, so maybe it will be very useful practically also.
I would just love to learn from the team involved in that, what that looks like in Ukraine. I can't speak to the Ukraine example. I'd love to learn more about it. But I do have concerns about how that vision of sovereign AI is being implemented in other parts of the world. And I want to differentiate between the notion of sovereign AI and the notion of public AI that I've talked about. I think the vulnerability of the sovereign AI model that I've seen is that it can be co-opted by large companies and particularly American companies. For example, OpenAI and NVIDIA are going around the world selling sovereign AI, saying to countries like Indonesia very prominently, we will build a sovereign AI system for you. And I don't think that's really sovereignty. I think that's really just introducing a new dependency between that country and those American corporations. And it's not solving some of the fundamental challenges that we've talked about in terms of having better transparency and oversight and responsiveness and capturing value for the local community. It's really arguably solving just one challenge, which is centering the compute ownership, giving compute ownership to the country but not any of those other challenges. And so that's why we see public AI as very different from sovereign AI. There are ways they can be compatible, but we're really asking for something that's very different than what NVIDIA and OpenAI are selling. And again, I'm not familiar with what that looks like in Ukraine today, and I would just love to learn from you all what's happening there.
Thank you. So basically, I don't know if Elena can speak out, but if not, it's okay. But basically, as I understand, the main goal is to use Ukrainian data to like not to amplify like not only Russian propaganda from the perspective of attacks I described, but also from the perspective that a lot of historical books, a lot of literature are from Soviet period, and they had like a Russian perspective on historical events. But I don't know, Elena, maybe you can speak more.
I have no additional comments, and it's really very interesting thoughts and recommendations, so we will implement them.
Okay,
But yeah,
great.
it's
Yeah.
such an important purpose to what you're describing, particularly given the specific threats from the Russian misinformation, to have models that are verifiably trained on data that is relevant to a jurisdiction, relevant to Ukrainians, and not polluted. I see huge value in that for sure.
Great. And we have one question in the chat. In what way can engineers contribute to automated fact checking while upholding the principles of free speech?
A great question. And I'm probably inevitably going to answer from a very American perspective here. As you are probably well aware, our First Amendment in the US is a very particular vision of what free speech looks like. And I know that's quite different from what free speech means and has been practiced in a lot of other countries, including in Europe. And I'm not familiar with the Ukrainian context as much, but I can at least answer from an American perspective. But from the American perspective, I think free speech means being able to say something that's wrong or maybe even be offensive, and for others to be able to counteract that with a different perspective. And so I think there's a lot of value to scientists and engineers sharing their technical perspective to say when we believe a policy direction is wrong or a statement about fact or the past is wrong. And in the US, historically, we've had maybe a good, maybe a bad, but I think certainly a vibrant marketplace of ideas where people are sharing those examples. But I think very clearly today that's broken down. It's very obvious today that a lot of Americans don't share the same understanding of what facts are. I imagine a lot of you might be aware of what I think is really tragic shooting of Renee Good in Minnesota in the past week. And if you've seen the American media reaction to that, it's just remarkably polarized in terms of people on the left, political left, and the political right watching videos of this person being shot by a federal official and having dramatically different reactions to that, almost as if they're watching two different videos. I think that just demonstrates that there's a breakdown in the effectiveness of that fact checking. But to me, having a technical expert comment on a situation like that and share their perspective is a good thing. I don't see it as contradictory to free speech to be able to share that perspective and to have multiple people share different perspectives on that. Where I think there maybe is the harder balance to strike is when there are corporate entities that control marketplaces of speech, that control platforms, inserting themselves in the position of doing that moderation. Obviously, with media platforms like Facebook, we've had a lot of change over time, evolution, and the extent to which they're willing to serve that moderating role. I tend to think that there is real importance and value for those platform owners to moderate, and I tend to think it is a fundamental problem when so much of our public conversation and ways of accessing information are concentrated in just one platform owner that has just one perspective on what that moderation should look like. To me, that concentration of power is the more fundamental issue than the idea that a platform should be a moderator.
Okay, thank you. I have another more broad maybe question than just LLMs. If AI becomes the layer through which people access the politics, I mean like chatbots and feeds and so on, which democratic principles should govern that layer and who actually enforces them?
Great question. First of all, I think the premise of the question is right, that increasingly the way that people access political information and even share their perspective back into the political debate is being mediated by technology and by AI specifically. So I think that is happening. To me, some of the principles that we should follow are making sure that all the institutions of both government and civil society, non-governmental organizations, have a role to play in that process. I think part of that looks like distributing the tools and the control over those tools across society. To go back to what we just discussed, instead of having just one platform, let's say, for example, Facebook, be the owner and the operator of those AI tools by which people are receiving, information about the news and public opinion and debate, and also the platform by which they share their perspective back to the world. Instead, distributing that, having many platforms and distributed ownership of those platforms, I think is very, very important. And then, so much of what we've already discussed in terms of the need for more transparency, accountability, and responsiveness in the development of the AI tools themselves, I think was equally important. We now face the problem not only of platform ownership, but also model ownership. So many of these platforms are building on the same small number of commercial corporate foundation models. I think that introduces another source of concentration of power and the opportunity to inject bias and control into our systems, and we need to diversify that. And so again, we've advocated for public AI not as a replacement that obviates the need for corporate AI altogether, but rather as part of a more diverse ecosystem of AI development that I think is more appropriate for many, many use cases.
Great. And if we are talking about like broader bias is not only incorporated in that corporate platforms. I mean that AI amplifies resources, and which mechanisms can prevent AI from widening the political inequality, both between parties, between citizens, and so on?
Great question. I accept the premise of this question as well, which is that we think of AI as a power amplifying technology. It is something that augments the capabilities and capacity of each of us as humans and of our institutions to do more things than we could have before. We analyze this in our book in terms of four specific differentiating capabilities of AI that makes it different than how we act and operate as humans in terms of the speed at which AI operates, the scale at which it can operate on many tasks at the same time, the um, the scope of which AI operates, the fact that an AI model can be trained to be an expert on many things, whereas it's very difficult for us as humans to have expertise that is that broad. And then finally, its sophistication, which does not mean being better, but rather being able to take into account more factors, being able to process more information as part of a task than a human could do. So AI does have those differentiating capabilities, and that leads to it being a power augmenting technology. And I hope some of the examples that I shared today, like Operation Love Serenade from Brazil and Maple from here in Massachusetts, resonate as ways that citizen groups, people, can leverage this technology to augment their power. You know, the engineers who built Operation Love Serenade in Brazil are using AI as a tool to give them more power over their government, to be a watchdog, to root out public corruption. I think that demonstrates that AI doesn't only have to augment the power of the wealthy corporations that are building it or the entrenched governments that are using it, but also of public uh, public interested groups, people, movements, labor unions. And I hope that those groups will innovate and find really valuable ways to use this technology to augment their power.
Great. And what about like the government itself? Should it be like, I don't know, redesigned? Which like institutional design should be implemented ideally to ensure that AI supports democracy, not like introduce censorship or like other problems?
Great question. I'll try and analyze that question the same way I organize the talk in terms of point processes, individual responses, and then more systemic change. In terms of those kind of point processes, I think we should demand more from our government, demand more responsiveness as technology evolves in general. You know, a simple historical example. When railroads are introduced, we should expect our mail delivery to happen faster than it did before. And you know, in the US, where we have a public institution for mail delivery, we should expect that to work better as that new technology develops. I think the same thing is true with AI. You know, in the US, we have a very multilingual society. You know, so many of my neighbors here in Massachusetts are not primarily English speakers. Many people speak Spanish, many people speak Vietnamese, etc. But our government historically has operated almost exclusively in English. Our legislature operates exclusively in English. There has been a major language barrier for people to participate or even get government services. And in the past, it was understandable. You know, it would be hard for a local office of government to be able to speak to people in every language that they may speak. But I think increasingly that's unacceptable. Increasingly, AI is a technology that is very effective for language translation. It's not perfect. There are mistakes, there are risks, but it's awfully good. And I think we should no longer allow government to operate in a way that doesn't fully serve all the people across those languages. Another example that we write about in our book, the special capability of AI to be fast, to have a speed that is different from humans, I think we should look for our government to leverage that. Processes that today that create harm because of how slow they are, we should demand that those go faster. You know, there's a really terrible, tragic example of this in the US. We have our Social Security Administration administers a disability benefit program. It's supposed to give people money and resources when they're disabled and can't work. And our process for authorizing those benefits, for telling people, yes, you can access this money, is so slow that thousands of people in the US die every year not having gotten any benefits because they're waiting for a response. I think, you know, in the US, we've recognized for decades that is unacceptable, but we haven't fixed it. And today, when we have technologies that can process applications, that can say yes to people faster, that can say, okay, you've met the requirements, it's clear, you get access to this benefit. That should happen much faster. We should hold government responsible for responsibly using the technology. Uh, in terms of um, in terms of more systemic change, I do think that AI makes more urgent some of the democratic renovations that we've probably known have needed to happen even since before AI. A lot of the reforms that we advocate for in our book are not really specific to technology. They're not really specific to AI. Rather, they're calling out problems that we know we need to fix that are exacerbated by AI. I'll give you yet another American example. I'm sorry, so many of my examples are US specific, but we have a really enormous problem, in my view, with campaign finance here, where elected officials receive lots and lots of money from lobbyists and donors, and that influences our politics. I think we've known for a long time that we need to reform that system, but it hasn't happened. And to me, the need for that finance reform in campaigning is so much more urgent now that AI is a technology that is concentrating wealth, that gives the wealthy even more power to administer lobbying effectively, to distribute funds in optimal ways that have their agenda enacted. I think we need to take more seriously and urgently the need for those fundamental reforms that are not specific to AI, but really are responsive to the problems that AI is exacerbating.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the chat. How can we bridge the knowledge gap between technical experts and policymakers so that AI regulations aren't obsolete by the time they are passed?
Great question. It's obviously a very real challenge. So many of us in the US have been watching with a lot of admiration the EU AI Act and how the European Union has gone much faster than we have in the US in trying to put in place a policy framework. Now, to the point of this question, I'm sure there's some decisions, the way that framework is set up, that will look foolish or inappropriate years from now as the technology changes. So I think the risk that's being called out here is very real. In the US, we had an example of that. The Biden administration issued an executive order that applied rules to AI models based on the number of teraflops that were used in model training. And just a few months after that executive order was released, the DeepSeek models were released in early 2025 that demonstrated that you can achieve equivalent technical performance at dramatically lower training compute cost. And all of a sudden, the numbers in that Biden EO executive order no longer made sense. So I think this is a very real risk. My general solution, the general solution we talk about in the book that addresses this, is to ask regulators and policymakers to focus on regulating activities and not entities. So, in other words, instead of asking them to be technical experts, to say, this is the shape that an AI system should have. This is the rules that are applied based on AI systems that meet these technical details versus that technical detail. Instead, what they should focus on is saying, in society in general, these are the activities that are appropriate and okay, and these activities are inappropriate. And those should be applied regardless of the technologies that are used in those activities. We should focus on holding people accountable and not differentiating between what types of machines can be used in what cases. So, I gave the example of benefits administration earlier. I think we should have rules about how insurance companies and governments that administer benefits are allowed to process information to make decisions about benefits administration. I don't think those rules need to be specific to what AI technology is used or how big those models are. We need rules about the activity, not the entity.
Great. So we are almost out of time. Do you have time for one more question?
May I? Yes, my name is Andrei Verlan. So I'm just curious. I have a question related to the potential risks, the risk management. So if we're talking about the democracy and AI, and me as a professor, so I'm right now in Norway, I'm teaching some engineering courses, and I'm not going to reveal the secret that as AI is extremely popular among the students, they've been using that everywhere for assignments, for presentation, everywhere. But at the same time, for example, in Europe, I know that within European universities, technical engineering universities, there is a strict, well, maybe not strict, but recommendation not to use certain platform of AI, and strong recommendation at the same time to use another platform for, like, okay, I will name it as a Copilot, for example. This is widely embedded into the Microsoft tools, so Copilot. There's one of them, but one of them are strictly not recommended to use. Is that related to potential risks, or and is there any correlation with the democracy of that? So I'm just curious about that.
It's
Thank
a
you.
great question. There's a lot wrapped up in that. Maybe I'll sort of focus on that question about the use of AI in education. And first, let me say, I do not have a teaching role at Harvard, so I don't experience that as an educator. But I have, of course, been a student, and I think of my own experience training as a scientist. I did my PhD in astrophysics. Most of my work was doing data science, doing computer programming to analyze data, and yet all the way through up until the later years of my PhD, my curriculum training as a scientist really did not involve computer science. It really did not involve the core skills for doing that work in research. In fact, when I took calculus courses, I don't know if this is the same in Ukraine, but in Ukraine, but in the US, primarily those calculus courses do not leverage symbolic manipulation programs. They don't leverage ways to use computers to solve integrals and derivatives, but rather it was all doing it by hand. And I think there's a good purpose for that. It's trying to teach humans those fundamental skills of reasoning, logic, and mathematics. And I understand the purpose for that. But I think we actually lost something. I feel like I lost something in my training by not being exposed to the modern tools of how work is done today in that field. When I was doing research in astrophysics, I was not solving integrals by hand. I was doing integration with computers. And I think I should have been taught in that way. I think the same is true in AI. We need to find some balance between making sure that students are not just, writing their essays with ChatGPT and not giving it any thought themselves, but we do also need to equip them to be able to use the tools that clearly will be part of how we do this work in the future. I don't have great solutions for that, but I really think there needs to be a balance and not either extreme.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we are definitely out of time. So thank you, Nathan. Thanks a lot for that exciting talk and exciting discussion also. Yeah, and thanks
Thank you.
for everybody for joining us today. Thank you.
It was my privilege. Thank you all.